close your eyes and let yourself drift back through time, to the year 1847, when the cobblestone streets of Portsmouth gleamed wet under the gaslight, and the air carried the mingled scents of tar, hemp, and hops from the nearby breweries. Listen to the distant cry of gulls and the rhythmic creaking of masts in the harbor as we begin our peaceful journey into the world of Thomas Hartwell, master sailmaker, whose life would intertwine with both the gentle art of his craft and the distant thunder of Britain's naval campaigns. The morning fog rolled in from the Solent like a soft gray blanket, muffling the sounds of the waking city. Thomas Hartwell stood at the entrance of the Old Anchor Brewery, an unusual location for a sail loft, yet one that had served Portsmouth's maritime community for 3 generations. The brewery's upper floors, once used for storing grain and hops, had been converted during the Napoleonic Wars when space near the dockyards had become precious. The thick brick walls kept the workspace cool in summer and retained warmth in winter, while the lingering aroma of malted barley created an oddly comforting atmosphere for the craftsmen who labored within. Thomas ran his weathered fingers along the doorframe, feeling the smooth grooves worn by countless hands before his. At 43 years of age, he had spent 28 years perfecting his craft, learning from his father, who had learned from his father before him. The sailmaking trade ran through his veins like the hemp fibers that ran through the canvas he shaped daily. As he climbed the worn wooden stairs to the sail loft, each step creaked a familiar tune. The sound echoed softly through the building, joining the gentle bubbling from the brewery's copper vessels on the ground floor, where master brewer William Pensworth was already beginning his day's work. The two trades existed in harmonious parallel, one providing sustenance for the body, the other creating the wings that carried Britain's vessels across the world's oceans. The sail loft stretched before him, bathed in the soft morning light filtering through tall windows that faced the harbor. Bolts of canvas, each 39 yards long and varying between 22 and 30 inches in width, stood like sentinels along the walls. The hemp and flax fabric, imported from the Baltic regions, possessed a particular quality that made it ideal for withstanding salt water and the tremendous forces of ocean winds. Thomas breathed in deeply, savoring the earthy scent of the raw materials mixed with the sweet undertones of brewing malt that perpetually permeated the space. His apprentices would arrive soon, young James Middlewood, barely 16 but showing promise with his steady hands, and Robert Clearwater, 19 and nearing the end of his 7-year apprenticeship. But for now, Thomas enjoyed these quiet moments alone with his craft, preparing for the day's work on a commission that carried more weight than most: new sails for HMS Ardent, a frigate preparing for deployment to the Mediterranean where tensions with various powers required a strong British naval presence. Thomas moved to his workbench, where his tools lay arranged with meticulous precision. His sailmaking palm, crafted from thick leather and fitted perfectly to his hand, rested beside an array of needles of varying sizes. The largest, used for sewing the bolt ropes that would run along the edges of the sails, were formidable implements, requiring significant strength to push through multiple layers of canvas. His pricking iron, used for making eyelet holes, gleamed dully in the morning light, its lignum vitae handle worn smooth from years of use. The floor of the loft had been marked with the dimensions of various sails, chalk lines creating ghostly templates that guided the cutting and assembly process. For HMS Ardent, Thomas would be creating a full complement of sails, the massive main course that would hang from the mainmast, topsails, topgallants, and the smaller but equally crucial jibs and staysails. Each required different weights of canvas and particular attention to the way the cloths were sewn together, for poorly constructed sails could nullify even the finest ship design. As Thomas began laying out the canvas for the fore topsail, he heard familiar footsteps on the stairs. William Pensworth appeared, carrying 2 steaming mugs of small beer, the weak, breakfast brew that sustained workers through their morning labors. The brewer's round face bore its customary cheerful expression, though Thomas noticed a slight tension around his friend's eyes that had become more common in recent months. Morning to you, Thomas, William said, setting one mug on the workbench. Starting early on the ardent sails, I see. Aye, Thomas replied, accepting the warm mug gratefully. The October morning carried a chill that seemed to seep through the old building's walls. She's to sail within the month, and Captain Morrison is particular about his canvas. He served under Admiral Napier in the Syrian campaign, you know. Learned the value of good sails when they were blockading Acre. William nodded thoughtfully, his expression growing more serious. Speaking of military matters, I've heard troubling news from my cousin in Ireland. The potato blight has worsened, and there's talk of uprisings. The garrison at Cork has been reinforced. Thomas paused in his measuring, considering the implications. More troops mean more supply ships, more naval patrols. We may see increased orders soon. Perhaps, William agreed, though I pray it doesn't come to that. War is good for business, they say, but the cost in human suffering. He trailed off, both men understanding the weight of such words. They had both lost friends and family to Britain's various military campaigns over the years. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James and Robert, their young voices carrying up the stairwell as they debated the merits of different knots. Thomas smiled slightly. Such enthusiasm reminded him of his own apprentice days, when every aspect of the craft seemed filled with wonder and possibility. "Good morning, Master Hartwell," they chorused upon entering, offering respectful nods to both men. "Morning, lads," Thomas replied. "James, you'll continue with the mizzen topsail we began yesterday. Robert, you'll assist me with cutting the forecourse. Mind the grain of the canvas, we must ensure the strongest threads bear the greatest strain." As the apprentices set to their tasks, Thomas began the methodical process of measuring and cutting. The canvas had to be laid out perfectly flat, without wrinkles or distortions that might affect the sail's shape when hung. He used his measuring stick, marked with the traditional measurements of the trade, moving with the practiced efficiency of countless repetitions. The work was meditative in its precision. Each seam had to overlap by exactly the right amount. Too little and the sail might tear under stress, too much and it would be unnecessarily heavy and would not set properly in light winds. The stitching itself required a particular rhythm, the sailmaker's palm pushing the needle through, the pull to tighten the thread, the careful maintenance of tension to ensure the seam lay flat. As the morning progressed, the sail loft filled with the quiet sounds of concentrated work, the whisper of canvas being unrolled, the soft thump of the rubber-headed mallet used to flatten seams, the rhythmic breathing of men absorbed in their craft. From below came the complementary sounds of the brewery, the splash of water, the clank of copper vessels, the low murmur of workers' voices. Thomas found himself thinking about the sailors who would depend on these sails. HMS Ardent would likely see action. The Mediterranean was rarely peaceful for long. Pirates still plagued the North African coast, despite the bombardment of Algiers 30 years prior. The Greek independence movement had created instability that rippled throughout the region. And there were always the French to consider. Despite the current peace, old enemies had a way of becoming new threats with little warning. He had sewn sails for ships that never returned, their fate unknown but likely tragic. The sea was an unforgiving mistress, and even the finest sails could not protect against all her moods. Yet there was pride in knowing that his work might make the difference between a successful voyage and disaster, between sailors returning home to their families or perishing in foreign waters. "Master Hartwell," Robert called softly, not wishing to disturb the concentration of others. "I've finished marking the cloths for cutting. Would you inspect them?" Thomas moved to where Robert had laid out the canvas, examining the chalk lines with a critical eye. The boy had done well, the measurements were precise, the angle of the cloths correct to ensure the optimal shape when sewn together. "Good work, Robert. You've learned to read the canvas grain properly." Begin cutting, but remember, measure twice, cut once. The morning sun climbed higher, its light shifting across the loft floor like a slow tide. Thomas paused occasionally to instruct his apprentices, demonstrating the proper way to roll a seam or explaining why certain reinforcements were placed at specific stress points. Teaching was as much a part of his role as creating. The knowledge had to be passed down, refined with each generation but never fundamentally altered from the principles that had governed sailmaking for centuries. Around midday, they received an unexpected visitor. Lieutenant Charles Blackwood of HMS Arden climbed the stairs, his uniform impeccable despite the industrial setting. Thomas had worked with Blackwood before, a competent officer who understood the importance of good sails to his ship's performance. Master Hartwell, the lieutenant greeted formally, though his expression was friendly. Captain Morrison sends his compliments and wishes to know how the work progresses. Steadily, Lieutenant, Thomas replied, wiping his hands on his leather apron. The forecourse is cut and we've begun sewing. The topsails are well underway. We remain on schedule for completion by month's end. Blackwood nodded, moving to examine the partially completed mizzen topsail that James was working on. Fine work, as always. The captain will be pleased. He paused, then added in a lower voice, between us, Thomas, we may sail sooner than planned. There's been an incident near Malta, a British merchant vessel attacked by corsairs. The Admiralty wants a stronger presence in the central Mediterranean. Thomas felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the same feeling he experienced whenever the reality of conflict intruded upon the peaceful rhythm of his work. We'll increase our pace if needed, Lieutenant. The Arden won't sail without her full complement of canvas. After Blackwood departed, the loft settled back into its working rhythm, though Thomas noticed his apprentices exchanging glances. The mention of corsairs and early deployment had clearly captured their imagination. Young men often romanticized naval service, seeing only the adventure and glory, not the harsh realities of life at sea or the violence of naval combat. Master, James ventured during a brief rest, did you ever consider going to sea yourself? Thomas smiled ruefully. Every sailmaker considers it at some point, lad. But I discovered early that my talents lay in creating sails, not in handling them. My younger brother took that path, served as sailmaker aboard HMS Vanguard for 12 years. He had stories that would curl your hair, and not all of them pleasant. What happened to him? Robert asked quietly. Retired after a skirmish off the coast of Burma left him with a permanent limp. Lives in Devon now, making sails for fishing boats and pleasure craft. A quieter life, but he seems content with it. The afternoon wore on, the October sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. The light in the loft took on a golden quality, warming the pale canvas and casting long shadows across the floor. Thomas worked on the reinforcement patches that would be sewn at the reef points, those crucial areas where the sail could be reduced in size during strong winds. Each patch had to be positioned precisely, sewn with extra strong thread in a pattern that distributed the stress evenly. The repetitive nature of the work allowed his mind to wander to evenings past, when his father had taught him the intricacies of the trade. They had worked by oil lamp light, his father's patient voice explaining how to judge the quality of canvas by its feel, how to detect flaws that might lead to failure under stress, how to read the weather patterns that would affect how a sail should be cut for different seasons and sailing routes. His father had served as a sailmaker during the wars with Napoleon, creating canvas for the ships that had fought at Trafalgar. He had known men who served under Nelson, had heard first-hand accounts of that great victory and the terrible cost it exacted. The sail loft had been a repository of naval history, each veteran sailmaker carrying stories of ships and battles, of storms weathered and passages completed. Now Thomas carried those stories forward, along with his own accumulated experiences. He had sewn sails for ships that explored the Arctic, searching for the Northwest Passage. He had created canvas for vessels bound for Australia, carrying convicts and settlers to that distant shore. His sails had carried tea from China, cotton from India, and timber from Canada. Each commission was a thread in the great tapestry of British maritime commerce and power. As the day's light began to fade, William appeared again, this time accompanied by his senior brewman, a grizzled veteran named Samuel Trent. "We're testing the new porter batch," William announced. "Thought you might appreciate a sample after your long day." The dark beer was rich and warming, its roasted flavors a perfect complement to the cooling evening. The 5 men, Thomas, his apprentices, William, and Samuel, stood by the great windows overlooking the harbor, watching as the naval vessels at anchor began lighting their lamps, creating constellations of light upon the dark water. "My grandfather remembered when this brewery supplied beer to Nelson's fleet," Samuel said quietly. "Casks and casks of it, loaded aboard ships bound for the Mediterranean. He used to say that British courage was 1 part training, 1 part discipline, and 1 part good English ale." They chuckled at that, though there was truth in the jest. The Navy's daily rum ration was famous, but beer was equally important, providing nutrition and safer hydration than water on long voyages. The brewery and the sail loft were both essential components of the naval infrastructure that maintained Britain's maritime supremacy. As the evening deepened, Thomas dismissed his apprentices, reminding them to arrive early the next morning. He remained behind, as was his custom, to review the day's work and plan for tomorrow. The sail loft was peaceful in the twilight, the canvas ghostly pale in the dim light, the tools casting mysterious shadows. He walked slowly along the laid-out sails, checking seams, testing the tension of the stitching, ensuring that everything met his exacting standards. This attention to detail was what separated a master craftsman from a mere tradesman. Lives depended on the quality of his work, sailors who would trust their lives to these sails in storms and battles, in the vast loneliness of the open ocean. The building settled around him with small creaks and sighs, the old timbers adjusting to the cooling temperature. From somewhere below came the sound of William locking up the brewery, the jingle of keys and the solid thump of bolts being thrown. Soon Thomas would do the same for the sail loft, but for now, he lingered, enjoying the solitude and the satisfaction of work well done. He thought about Lieutenant Blackwood's news of the Corsair attack near Malta. The Mediterranean had been a dangerous body of water since ancient times, its numerous islands and inlets providing perfect hiding spots for pirates. The Royal Navy patrolled regularly, but they couldn't be everywhere at once. Merchant vessels still fell victim to raiders, their crews enslaved or ransomed, their cargoes stolen. HMS Arden would join that patrol, her sails filled with wind as she hunted for corsairs among the Greek islands or along the North African coast. Her guns would speak with authority when pirates were found, her marines would board suspicious vessels, her presence would reassure British merchants that their nation protected their interests. But first, she needed her sails, and Thomas would ensure she had the finest canvas possible. Tomorrow, he would begin work on the main course, the largest and most important sail. It would require all his skill and experience to create a sail that could withstand the fierce Mediterranean storms while still being responsive enough for the light winds common in summer. As he finally locked the sail loft and descended the stairs, Thomas paused at the entrance to breathe in the night air. The smell of the sea was strong tonight, carried on an easterly breeze that promised fair weather tomorrow. The stars were beginning to appear, the same stars that sailors would use to navigate once HMS Arden put to sea. He walked slowly through the narrow streets toward his modest home, his footsteps echoing off the cobblestones. Portsmouth at night was a different city than during the day, quieter, more mysterious, with shadows that could hide both danger and wonder. Gas lamps created pools of yellow light, between which stretched areas of darkness where anything might lurk. His route took him past the Sailor's Rest Tavern, from which came the sound of singing and laughter. Through the windows, he could see naval personnel and dockyard workers relaxing after their labors, sharing drinks and stories. He recognized some of them, men who had sailed on ships bearing his sails, who had trusted his craftsmanship with their lives. One voice rose above the others, singing an old sea shanty about a ship bound for the Indies. Others joined in on the chorus, their voices harmonizing in the way that only sailors could manage, having practiced during long watches at sea. The song spoke of longing for home, of storms weathered and battles won, of the brotherhood forged by shared danger and hardship. Thomas continued on, the song following him through the streets, a reminder of the human element in all his work. These sails he created were not just technical achievements, they were the wings that carried men on their journeys, that brought them home to waiting families, that enabled the commerce and military power that sustained the empire. His house stood on a quiet side street, its windows dark except for a single candle burning in the front room, his wife Margaret's signal that she had waited up for him. He smiled at the sight, quickening his pace slightly. After the industrial atmosphere of the sail loft, the warmth of home beckoned irresistibly. Margaret greeted him at the door, her face showing the patient understanding of a sailmaker's wife. She knew the demands of the trade, the long hours required when a commission was urgent, the weight of responsibility that her husband carried. "Supper is keeping warm," she said simply, taking his coat. "And there's a letter from your brother in Devon." Over a meal of mutton stew and fresh bread, Thomas read his brother's letter aloud. William wrote of the quieter pace of life in Devon, of the pleasure craft he now fitted with sails, of the wealthy merchants and minor nobility who commissioned yacht sails for their leisure pursuits. It was a different world from the naval work Thomas did, but the fundamental craft remained the same. "He seems content," Margaret observed, clearing the dishes. "Do you ever think of following his path? Leaving the naval work behind?" Thomas considered the question, one that had occurred to him more frequently as he aged. "Perhaps someday," he admitted. "But not yet. There's still important work to be done here. Ships like the Arden need proper sails, and there are fewer master sailmakers than there once were. The young ones need training, the traditions need preserving." They sat by the fire for a while, Margaret working on her needlepoint while Thomas sketched designs for a new type of storm sail he had been considering. The domestic peace was a sharp contrast to the day's talk of corsairs and military deployments, yet both were part of the same tapestry of life in a naval city. As the fire burned lower, they retired to bed, Thomas's mind already turning to tomorrow's work. The main course would require careful planning. The largest sail on the ship, it bore enormous stresses and needed to be perfectly balanced. He would have to ensure the canvas cloths were aligned to provide maximum strength while maintaining the proper shape for efficient sailing. Sleep came slowly, his mind still active with calculations and considerations. Through the window, he could hear the distant sound of the harbor, the creak of rigging, the splash of water against hulls, the occasional shout of a night watchman. These sounds had been the backdrop to his entire life, as familiar and comforting as his own heartbeat. In his dreams, he saw sails billowing in the wind, white against blue sky, carrying ships to distant horizons. He saw his father's hands guiding his own, teaching him the ancient craft. He saw the faces of sailors who had trusted his work, and the pride in their eyes when they spoke of how well their ship sailed. The next morning arrived gray and misty, the sun struggling to penetrate the thick blanket of fog that had rolled in overnight. Thomas rose early, as was his habit, and made his way through the quiet streets to the sail loft. The brewery was already active, the sweet smell of mashing grain mixing with the salty tang of the sea air. In the sail loft, he began laying out the canvas for HMS Arden's main course. This sail would be nearly 60 feet wide and 40 feet tall, requiring multiple cloths of canvas to be sewn together with absolute precision. The weight alone would be considerable, several hundred pounds of canvas that would need to be handled carefully during construction. James and Robert arrived to find their master already deep in concentration, measuring and marking with the focus of a mathematician solving a complex equation. They took their places quietly, understanding that this was crucial work requiring complete attention. "Today, lads," Thomas said without looking up, "you'll learn about creating the largest sails. Watch carefully, the principles are the same as smaller sails, but the scale introduces complications. The canvas wants to distort under its own weight, and we must account for that in our cutting." He demonstrated how to support the canvas properly, using wooden battens to keep it flat while marking. The chalk lines had to be perfectly straight, the angles exact. Any deviation would be magnified when the sail was hoisted, potentially causing it to set improperly or wear unevenly. As they worked, Thomas shared stories from his apprenticeship, when he had helped create sails for ships of the line, the massive warships that had been the backbone of the Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. Those ships had carried sails even larger than what they were creating now, requiring teams of sailmakers working in coordination. "The largest sail I ever worked on was for HMS Queen Charlotte," he recalled, his hands never pausing in their work. "The main course was 70 feet wide, took 6 of us to handle it properly. She carried that sail into battle at the glorious 1st of June, back in 1794. My master had been part of the team that made it, and he never tired of telling the story." The work continued steadily through the morning, with Thomas directing his apprentices in cutting the individual cloths while he began the delicate work of sewing the head of the sail, the top edge that would be attached to the yard. This required special reinforcement, as it bore the full weight of the sail and transmitted all the wind's force to the ship's rigging. Around midday, they received another visitor, this time an unexpected one. Admiral Sir George Seymour, recently returned from commanding the Pacific Station, climbed the stairs to the sail loft. Thomas had never met the admiral, though he knew him by reputation, a fighting sailor who had seen action in the War of 1812 and had spent years suppressing piracy in the East Indies. "Master Hartwell," the admiral said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. "I've heard excellent reports of your work. I'm here on a personal matter. I'm fitting out a private yacht for my retirement, and I want the best sailmaker in Portsmouth to handle her canvas." Thomas was honored but also surprised. Naval officers of the admiral's rank usually had their personal vessels fitted out in London or Southampton, where the yacht builders catered to the wealthy and powerful. "I'd be pleased to assist, Admiral," Thomas replied carefully. "Though my current obligation is to HMS Ardent. She has priority as a commissioned warship." "Of course," the admiral agreed. "I wouldn't have it any other way. The Navy's needs come first. But when you have completed that commission, I would like to discuss my requirements. I have some specific ideas about sail configuration that I've developed over my years at sea." After the admiral departed, leaving his card and a promise to return in a fortnight, the sail loft buzzed with subdued excitement. Such a commission would bring prestige to Thomas's workshop and provide interesting technical challenges different from the standardized naval work. "Imagine," Robert said with awe, "creating sails for an admiral's personal yacht. It would be displayed at all the finest harbors, seen by the most important people in the empire." "Aye," Thomas agreed, "but remember, lad, whether it's an admiral's yacht or a humble fishing boat, our duty is the same, to create the best sails possible. The wind doesn't care about rank or social standing. It tests all canvas equally." The afternoon was devoted to the painstaking process of sewing the massive seams of the main course. Thomas used a special technique for these large sails, creating a double-folded seam that provided extra strength without adding excessive weight. His sailmaker's palm was essential here, providing the leverage needed to push the heavy needle through 4 layers of canvas. The rhythm of the work was almost hypnotic: push, pull, tighten, advance. Each stitch had to be uniform in size and tension. Thomas's hands moved with the unconscious precision of long practice, his mind free to consider other matters while his body performed the familiar motions. He thought about the Admiral's visit and what it might mean for his business. Private commissions were lucrative and could lead to other wealthy clients. Yet he felt a stronger obligation to the naval work, to the ordinary sailors who depended on his sails for survival. There was something pure about creating canvas for warships, knowing they served the nation's interests rather than personal pleasure. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sail loft, a commotion arose from the street below. Shouts and the sound of running feet drew Thomas to the window, where he saw a crowd gathering around a naval messenger who had just arrived on horseback. William appeared at the top of the stairs moments later, his face grave. "There's been a naval engagement," he said breathlessly. "Off the coast of Portugal. A British frigate engaged with slave traders. The frigate prevailed, but with casualties. They're bringing the wounded to the naval hospital." Thomas felt the familiar mix of pride and sorrow that such news always brought. The Royal Navy's campaign against the slave trade was noble work, but it came at a cost in British lives. He wondered if any of the ships involved had carried sails of his making, if his craftsmanship had played a role in the victory. "We should finish for the day," he told his apprentices. "Such news deserves reflection. Tomorrow we'll continue with renewed purpose, knowing that our work supports those who risk their lives for justice." As they secured the sail loft for the evening, Thomas noticed both young men seemed subdued, the reality of naval service perhaps becoming clearer to them. It was one thing to dream of adventure and glory, another to confront the human cost of maintaining order on the seas. That evening, Thomas walked home through streets filled with discussion of the engagement. At the Sailors' Rest, veterans debated tactics and speculated about which ship had been involved. The consensus seemed to be HMS Grecian, known to be patrolling those waters in search of slavers. At home, Margaret had already heard the news. She had prepared a simple supper, understanding that her husband would have little appetite for elaborate food when his mind was on such matters. They ate in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Later, as they sat by the fire, Margaret asked, "Do you ever regret not going to see yourself? Being part of such actions directly?" Thomas considered before answering. "Sometimes, perhaps. But I've made my peace with my role. The sailors need good sails to do their duty. I provide them. It's not glorious work, but it's necessary. Every person who contributes to the Navy's mission matters, whether they sail the ships or build them, whether they fight the battles or supply the provisions." That night, sleep came fitfully. Thomas dreamed of sails torn by cannon shot, of sailors struggling to repair canvas in the midst of battle, of the slave traders' victims freed by British action. He woke several times, checking the time, anxious for dawn and the resumption of work that would quiet his restless mind. The next day brought clearer weather and renewed purpose to the sail loft. Thomas drove himself and his apprentices hard, completing the main course's central section and beginning work on the reinforcement bands that would run horizontally across the sail at the reef points. These bands were crucial for the sail's longevity, preventing tears from spreading when the sail was reduced in heavy weather. Lieutenant Blackwood visited again, bringing more specific news of the engagement. HMS Grecian had indeed been involved, intercepting a slaver carrying over 300 souls in horrific conditions. The battle had been fierce but brief, the slaver's crew fighting desperately to avoid capture and trial. The Grecian sails were shot through in several places, Blackwood reported. Her sailmaker and crew did excellent field repairs, but she'll need new canvas when she returns to port. Your work, Master Hartwell, ensures our ships can maintain such patrols. The lieutenant also brought news that HMS Ardent's departure had been officially moved forward. She would sail in 3 weeks rather than 4, requiring an acceleration of the sail-making schedule. Thomas accepted the challenge without complaint, knowing that his apprentices would rise to meet it. The following days blurred together in a marathon of concentrated effort. They worked longer hours, starting before dawn and continuing by lamplight into the evening. The main course was completed, then the forecourse, each massive sail requiring multiple men to handle and fold properly. William kept them supplied with small beer and food, understanding the importance of their work. The brewery workers would sometimes climb to the sail loft during their breaks, watching in fascination as the great sails took shape. There was a sense of shared purpose in the building, both trades contributing to the greater good. One evening, as Thomas worked late on a particularly complex portion of the mizzen royal, a small but crucial sail that helped balance the ship in light winds, he was surprised by a visitor. Captain Morrison of HMS Ardent himself appeared in the sail loft, accompanied by his sailing master. "I wanted to see the progress myself," the captain explained. "These sails will carry us through whatever challenges we face in the Mediterranean. I need to know they're being crafted with care." Thomas showed them the completed sails, explaining the reinforcements he had added and the reasoning behind certain design choices. The captain listened intently, asking intelligent questions that showed his deep understanding of how sails affected his ship's performance. "You've exceeded my expectations, Master Hartwell," Captain Morrison said finally. "These are among the finest sails I've seen. My ship will be well served." After the officers departed, Thomas stood alone in the sail loft, feeling a deep satisfaction. Such praise from an experienced captain was the highest compliment a sailmaker could receive. It validated years of dedication to his craft, countless hours of painstaking work, and the preservation of techniques passed down through generations. As the deadline approached, the pace became even more intense. The smaller sails, the jibs, staysails, and royals, still needed completion. These required different techniques than the large courses, being cut differently to handle the various angles and stresses they would encounter. The triangular jibs in particular demanded precise geometry to ensure they would set properly when hauled out on the bowsprit. James had progressed remarkably during this intensive period, his stitching becoming more confident and precise. Thomas began allowing him to work on more critical portions of the sails, carefully supervising but increasingly trusting the young man's judgment. Robert, nearing the end of his apprenticeship, worked with an independence that pleased Thomas greatly. He could be trusted with entire sections of sail, requiring only periodic inspection. Soon he would be ready to work as a journeyman, perhaps eventually establishing his own sail loft. One morning, with just a week remaining before HMS Ardent's departure, they faced a crisis. A bolt of canvas intended for the main topgallant was found to be flawed, with weak threads running through one section that would certainly fail under stress. There was no time to order replacement canvas from the regular suppliers. Thomas made a quick decision. He had been saving a bolt of exceptional canvas for the Admiral's Yacht Commission, but duty to the Navy came first. The topgallant was cut from this premium material, resulting in a sail of exceptional quality that would serve HMS Ardent well in the challenging conditions of the Mediterranean. The final push was exhausting. They worked in shifts, with Thomas supervising constantly, checking every seam, every reinforcement, every rope attachment point. The sails were more than just canvas now, they were the product of accumulated skill, dedication, and a deep understanding of the sea's demands. 3 days before departure, all the sails were complete. They lay folded in the sail loft, each carefully labeled and ready for transport to the dockyard. Thomas, James, and Robert stood looking at their work, tired but proud. They had created a full suit of sails for a warship in record time without compromising quality. Lieutenant Blackwood arrived with a party of sailors to collect the sails. As each one was carefully carried down the stairs and loaded onto wagons, Thomas felt the mixture of satisfaction and melancholy that always accompanied the completion of a major commission. These sails, which had consumed his thoughts and efforts for weeks, would soon be far from Portsmouth, facing whatever challenges the Mediterranean offered. "You've done the Navy proud, Master Hartwell," Blackwood said, shaking his hand firmly. "I'll make sure Captain Morrison knows how hard you and your lads work to meet our advanced schedule." The next day, Thomas and his apprentices were invited to watch HMS Arden being fitted with her new sails. They stood on the dockyard, observing as sailors swarmed over the rigging, bending the sails to the yards with practiced efficiency. Seeing the canvas they had created being mounted on the ship was deeply satisfying, the culmination of their efforts made tangible. The sails looked magnificent in the morning sun, the white canvas bright against the dark rigging and hull. When the first sail was unfurled for testing, it set perfectly, filling with the light breeze and pulling taut without wrinkles or distortions. Thomas allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Captain Morrison spotted them and walked over. "Master Hartwell, your sails are superb. They'll serve us well whatever we encounter. The Admiralty should know they have a true craftsman in Portsmouth." 2 days later, HMS Arden sailed on the morning tide. Thomas, along with many others, watched from the harbor walls as she made her way toward the open sea. Her sails were set magnificently, catching the wind and driving her forward with purpose. The sight stirred something deep in Thomas's chest, pride, certainly, but also a connection to something greater than himself. As the ship disappeared over the horizon, Thomas turned back toward the sail loft. Admiral Seymour's yacht commission awaited, a different challenge requiring different skills. But first, he would give his apprentices a day of rest. They had earned it through their dedication and hard work. That evening, Thomas sat with Margaret in their small garden, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that would guide HMS Arden on her journey, that sailors had used for navigation since humans first ventured onto the ocean. "Are you content?" Margaret asked, taking his weathered hand in hers. Thomas considered the question. His work was hard, often repetitive, sometimes thankless. He would never achieve fame or fortune. But he had mastered a crucial craft, had trained the next generation, had contributed to his nation's maritime power and the fight against injustice on the seas. "Yes," he said finally. "I am content. My sails are on the ocean, carrying good men on important missions. What more could a craftsman ask for?" The weeks following HMS Arden's departure brought a different rhythm to the sail loft. Admiral Seymour's yacht commission provided an interesting change of pace, requiring finer canvas and more elaborate sail plans than naval vessels. The Admiral proved to be an engaged client, visiting frequently to discuss modifications based on his decades of sailing experience. The yacht, christened Seahorse, was a beauty, sleek lines, polished brass fittings, and woodwork that gleamed like honey in the sunlight. Her sails would need to be equally impressive, combining functionality with an aesthetic elegance appropriate for her status as a gentleman's vessel. Thomas found himself enjoying the creative freedom the commission offered. Unlike naval sails, which followed strict Admiralty specifications, yacht sails could incorporate innovative features. The Admiral wanted experimental reef point placements that would allow for more precise sail adjustment, and an unusual cut to the jibs that he believed would improve upwind performance. As autumn deepened toward winter, news began filtering back from the Mediterranean. HMS Arden had successfully engaged a corsair vessel off the coast of Tunisia, liberating captured merchants and recovering stolen cargo. The engagement had been conducted primarily through superior sailing, with Captain Morrison using his ship's excellent canvas to outmaneuver the pirates. Thomas received a letter from Lieutenant Blackwood describing the action. "Your sails performed magnificently. We were able to point higher into the wind than our opponent, allowing us to gain the weather gauge and force an engagement on our terms. The main course took 2 shots through it but held together thanks to your reinforcements, allowing us to maintain pursuit." Such news warmed Thomas more than any fire could. His work had directly contributed to the liberation of captives and the protection of lawful commerce. The long hours, the careful attention to detail, the insistence on quality, all had been validated in the crucible of actual combat. Winter brought its own challenges to the sail loft. The cold made the canvas stiff and difficult to work with, requiring the workspace to be heated more than usual. Thomas's hands, already weathered from decades of work, cracked and bled in the dry air, requiring frequent application of lanolin to remain functional. Yet the work continued. Orders came in from merchant vessels, fishing boats, and coastal traders. Each commission brought its own requirements and challenges. Thomas used these varied projects to broaden his apprentices' experience, ensuring they understood not just how to make sails, but why certain choices were made for different vessels and purposes. James was developing a particular talent for sail repair, able to assess damaged canvas and determine the most effective way to restore it to serviceability. This was a valuable skill, as ships often limped into port with sails damaged by storms or combat, needing quick repairs to return to sea. Robert showed an aptitude for the business side of sailmaking, understanding how to estimate costs, manage inventory, and deal with clients. Thomas began including him in negotiations and planning sessions, preparing him for the day when he might run his own establishment. One gray February morning, a familiar figure appeared in the sail loft. Thomas's brother William had traveled from Devon, bringing news and seeking advice. Over tea in the warm corner of the loft, the brothers discussed their trade and its future. "The world is changing, Thomas," William said thoughtfully. "I've heard talk of ships powered by steam alone, requiring no sails at all. There's even word of iron ships that won't need the constant maintenance of wood." Thomas nodded slowly. He had heard similar rumors. The SS Great Britain, that marvel of engineering launched just a few years ago, represented a possible future where sail makers might become obsolete. Yet he couldn't quite believe that wind power would be entirely abandoned. "Perhaps," he conceded, "but steam engines fail, coal runs out. The wind is always there, always free. I think there will always be a place for sails, even if their role changes." The brothers spent the day working together, their hands moving in the synchronized rhythm learned in childhood. It was pleasant to work alongside someone who understood the craft as deeply as he did, who could anticipate needs without words, who shared the same foundation of knowledge and technique. That evening, they dined at the Sailor's Rest, listening to the tales of merchant sailors recently returned from the Americas. The stories were of expansion and opportunity, of new ports opening along the California coast, of the growing trade with China and Japan. Each story implied more ships, more sails, more work for craftsmen like themselves. One grizzled boatswain, deep in his cups, stood and raised his mug. To the sail makers, he declared loudly, "Without them, we'd be rowing like ancient slaves or stuck in port forever. They give us wings to cross the oceans." The toast was taken up by others, and Thomas found himself uncomfortably the center of attention. Yet there was genuine appreciation in the sailors' eyes, a recognition of the vital role his trade played in their lives. Spring arrived slowly that year, winter reluctant to release its grip on Portsmouth. But eventually, the days grew longer and warmer, and the pace of work in the sail loft increased. Ships that had wintered in port needed new sails for the sailing season, and fresh commissions arrived daily. Admiral Seymour's yacht was finally ready for her sails, and the installation was an event of some note in Portsmouth. The admiral had invited various dignitaries to witness the fitting out of his vessel, understanding that such displays were part of maintaining one's social standing. The sails Thomas had created for Seahorse were works of art as much as functional items. The canvas was the finest available, so tightly woven it seemed to glow in the sunlight. The stitching was invisible except upon close inspection, each seam perfect in its execution. Even the sail bags, usually utilitarian items, had been crafted with care, bearing the yacht's name in elegant lettering. As the sails were bent to the yards and unfurled for the first time, there was an audible murmur of appreciation from the assembled crowd. They set beautifully, without a wrinkle or imperfection, transforming the yacht from an elegant vessel into something truly magnificent. Master Hartwell, Admiral Seymour said, his satisfaction evident, "You've exceeded my highest expectations. These sails are worthy of a flagship." The Admiral's approval brought a flood of new yacht commissions from other wealthy residents of Portsmouth and beyond. Thomas found himself in the unexpected position of having to turn down work, his order book full for months ahead. It was a pleasant problem to have, but it also brought new pressures. He decided to take on another apprentice, a young boy named Timothy Carpenter whose father had been lost at sea. The boy showed promise, with steady hands and a good eye for detail. James and Robert took on the role of senior apprentices, teaching Timothy the basics while continuing their own advanced training. Summer brought news of HMS Ardent's continued success in the Mediterranean. She had participated in a showing of force at Alexandria, her sails and those of her squadron filling the harbor with British power. The diplomatic mission had been successful, with local rulers agreeing to suppress piracy in their waters and protect British merchant vessels. Thomas took quiet pride in such news, knowing that his sails had played a small part in projecting British influence and protecting lawful trade. It was a reminder that his work, however humble it might seem, connected to greater purposes and distant events. One particularly hot July day, work in the sail loft was interrupted by excitement in the street below. A merchant vessel had arrived from India bearing news of military action on the northwest frontier. The complex political situation there had erupted into open conflict, with British forces engaged against tribal warriors in the mountainous terrain. The news prompted discussion in the sail loft about the role of sea power in supporting land campaigns so far from the ocean. Supplies, reinforcements, and communications all depended on ships making the long voyage around Africa to India. Without reliable sails, such distant military operations would be impossible to sustain. "It makes you think," Robert observed, "how everything connects. We sit here in Portsmouth, sewing canvas, but our work affects events thousands of miles away." "That's the nature of empire," Thomas replied. "Every trade, every skill contributes to the whole. We're all threads in the same great sail, you might say." As summer turned to autumn, Thomas received an unexpected commission. The Royal Navy was experimenting with new sail configurations for their latest frigates, seeking to improve speed and maneuverability. They wanted Portsmouth's best sailmaker to create prototype sails for testing. The technical challenges were significant. The experimental designs required unusual cuts and reinforcement patterns, pushing the boundaries of traditional sailmaking techniques. Thomas found himself energized by the challenge, his mind engaged in solving problems that had no established solutions. Working closely with naval architects and experienced sailing masters, Thomas developed sails that incorporated radical design elements. Some proved failures when tested, the sails setting poorly or failing to deliver the expected performance improvements. But others showed promise, particularly a new design for staysails that seemed to significantly improve a ship's ability to sail close to the wind. The experimental work reminded Thomas why he loved his craft. It wasn't just about repeating established patterns, but about understanding the fundamental principles of how wind and canvas interacted, and using that knowledge to push the boundaries of what was possible. Winter came early that year, with November bringing snow and bitter cold winds from the north. The sail loft, with its large windows and high ceilings, was difficult to heat adequately. Thomas invested in better stoves and arranged the workspace to take advantage of what warmth they provided. Despite the cold, work continued at a steady pace. The experimental sails had attracted attention from the Admiralty, and Thomas received an official commendation for his innovative work. There was talk of adopting some of his designs for the next generation of naval vessels. James completed his apprenticeship that winter, becoming a journeyman sailmaker. Thomas watched with pride as the young man demonstrated his skills before the guild examiners, creating a perfect storm jib in just 2 days. It was a reminder that his legacy would live on through those he had trained. Robert, too, was nearing the end of his training. He had expressed interest in eventually establishing his own sail loft in Southampton, where the growing commercial trade offered opportunities for an ambitious young craftsman. Thomas supported the idea, knowing that the trade needed to expand to meet growing demand. Christmas brought a brief respite from work. Thomas and Margaret hosted a modest celebration for the apprentices and journeymen, along with William and his brewery workers. The gathering was warm and convivial, with stories shared and songs sung, the various trades that supported Britain's maritime power coming together in fellowship. As 1847 turned to 1848, Thomas reflected on the changes he had witnessed in his decades of sailmaking. Ships were growing larger, voyages longer, and the demands on sails ever greater. Yet the fundamental craft remained unchanged: the careful selection of materials, the precise cutting and sewing, the attention to detail that separated good sails from great ones. News arrived that HMS Ardent had been ordered to the Pacific, to join the squadron there in showing the flag and protecting British interests. Her Mediterranean service had been exemplary, and Captain Morrison had specifically praised the quality of his ship's sails in his reports to the Admiralty. Before Ardent departed for her new station, she would return to Portsmouth for refitting. Thomas looked forward to seeing how his sails had weathered their service, what could be learned from their wear patterns, and how future sails might be improved based on that experience. The cycle continued, ships departing and returning, sails being created and repaired, apprentices learning and advancing, the great maritime enterprise of Britain sustained by countless craftsmen like Thomas, each contributing their skills to the whole. As he stood in the sail loft one gray February morning, watching his apprentices work with concentrated focus, listening to the sounds of the brewery below and the harbor beyond, Thomas felt a deep satisfaction. This was his world, his contribution to something greater than himself. The sails he created would travel further than he ever would, carrying British commerce, power, and ideals across the globe. The legacy of the Victorian sailmaker was not one of fame or fortune, but of quiet competence and vital contribution. In an age of empire and expansion, when Britain's influence reached every corner of the globe, it was craftsmen like Thomas Hartwell who made it all possible, one carefully sewn seam at a time. As spring 1848 arrived, bringing with it rumors of revolution on the continent and uncertainty in the air, Thomas continued his work with steady determination. Whatever changes might come, ships would still need sails, and he would continue to provide them with all the skill and dedication he possessed. The sail loft above the Old Anchor Brewery would continue to be a place where ancient craft met modern needs, where the patient accumulation of skill served the demands of a rapidly changing world, where the rhythm of needle and thread echoed the greater rhythms of trade and empire. The morning HMS Ardent returned to Portsmouth was shrouded in a thick spring mist that turned the world into a study of grays and shadows. Thomas stood at the harbor with hundreds of others, watching as the frigate materialized from the fog like a ghost ship, her masts towering into the murky air, her sails furled but still visible as pale bundles against the yards. Even from a distance, he could see the wear on his canvas, the slight discoloration from salt and sun, the patches where emergency repairs had been made, the subtle changes in shape that came from thousands of miles of service. These were his sails coming home, bearing the evidence of their journey like an old soldier bearing scars. Captain Morrison had sent word that he wanted Thomas to inspect the sails personally, to learn what could be improved for future commissions. It was an unusual request. Most captains simply ordered new sails when needed without concerning themselves with the sailmaker's education. But Morrison understood that knowledge flowed both ways, that the craftsman could learn from the sailor's experience just as the sailor depended on the craftsman's skill. 2 days later, Thomas, accompanied by Robert and young Timothy, boarded HMS Ardent at her berth. The ship smelled of tar, salt, and that indefinable scent that all vessels acquired after long voyages, a mixture of humanity, cooking, gunpowder, and the sea itself. Sailors moved about their duties with practiced efficiency, but many paused to nod respectfully to Thomas, recognizing him as the creator of their ship's wings. The sailing master, a weathered Scotsman named Macpherson, led them through a systematic inspection of each sail. The main course showed the most wear. As expected, it bore the brunt of normal sailing. But the wear patterns told a story that Thomas read like a book. Heavy weather off Cape St. Vincent had stressed the starboard side more than the port. The reinforcements at the reef points had performed perfectly, showing minimal strain despite obvious hard use. "You see here," Macpherson pointed to a section of the fore topsail, "we had to make emergency repairs during a blow in the Adriatic. Your original stitching held, Master Hartwell, but the canvas itself gave way. Not your fault, we pushed her harder than any sail should be pushed, trying to reach a merchant under attack by pirates." Thomas examined the repair work with professional interest. The ship's sailmaker had done competent work under what must have been trying conditions. The stitching was uneven but strong, the patch properly aligned with the canvas grain. He made mental notes about adding additional reinforcement to that particular stress point in future sails. Young Timothy watched everything with wide eyes, absorbing his first real lesson in how sails performed in actual service rather than theory. Thomas encouraged him to touch the canvas, to feel how it had changed from its original state, to understand that sails were living things that evolved through use. "Look here, boy," Thomas instructed, showing Timothy where chafe from the rigging had worn the canvas thin. "This is why we add extra layers at these points. Imagine this were happening during a storm, with the ship's safety depending on the sail holding together." The inspection took most of the day, with Thomas filling a notebook with observations and sketches. Some of his innovations had worked brilliantly. The diagonal reinforcements he had added to the jibs had prevented the stretching that usually occurred in those sails. Others needed refinement. The experimental stitching pattern on the mizzen royal had created unexpected stress points. As they prepared to leave, Captain Morrison himself appeared, having returned from meetings at the Admiralty. "Master Hartwell, I understand you've been inspecting our canvas. What's your verdict?" "Your sails have served you well, Captain, and been well served by your crew's maintenance. With proper repair, most can sail again. But I would recommend new fore and main courses before your Pacific voyage. The storms around Cape Horn will test them severely." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "I concur. Can you have new courses ready within 6 weeks? We sail on the summer tide." "It will be done, Captain," Thomas assured him, already planning the work schedule in his mind. Back at the sail loft, Thomas gathered his workers, now including not just Robert and James, who had returned as a journeyman, but also Timothy and 2 new apprentices recommended by the guild. The Ardent Commission would be good training for them all, a chance to see how their work connected to the greater purpose of naval service. The spring of 1848 was a time of change across Europe. News arrived daily of revolutions and upheavals, France convulsing with another revolution, unrest in the German states, nationalist movements in Italy and Hungary. Britain watched nervously, her island status providing some insulation but not immunity from continental troubles. In the sail loft, these distant events seemed less important than the immediate work at hand. Yet Thomas understood that such instability meant the Navy would be busier than ever, showing the flag, protecting British interests, and potentially evacuating British subjects from troubled areas. Every sail they made might play a role in these unfolding dramas. William the brewer often climbed the stairs during his breaks, bringing news from the taverns and coffee houses where political discussions raged. "They're saying the French have declared another republic," he reported one afternoon. "There's worry it might spread here, the Chartists are planning another demonstration." Thomas continued his steady stitching as he replied. "Revolution is like a poorly made sail, it might look impressive when first unfurled, but it tears apart under stress. Britain changes slowly, like a well-maintained ship. That's our strength." The work on Ardent's new courses proceeded smoothly. Thomas had refined his techniques based on the inspection, adding subtle improvements that would extend the sail's life and improve their performance. He involved all his workers in the project, using it as a teaching opportunity. One particularly educational moment came when Timothy questioned why certain seams were sewn with a particular stitch pattern. Rather than simply explaining, Thomas had him create 2 sample pieces, one with the traditional method, one with a simpler pattern. Then they subjected both to stress tests, pulling and twisting until Timothy could see for himself how the traditional method distributed forces more evenly. "Never accept because we've always done it that way as an answer," Thomas advised. "But also don't dismiss traditional methods without understanding why they developed. Most of our techniques exist because generations of sailmakers found them to work best." As May arrived with unusual warmth, the sail loft became almost unbearably hot during afternoon hours. Thomas adjusted the work schedule, starting earlier in the morning and taking a longer midday break when the heat was worst. During these breaks, he often found himself in conversation with William in the relative coolness of the brewery's cellars, where the beer aged in massive wooden casks. "We're both preservers of tradition," William observed one particularly hot afternoon, drawing samples from different casks to test their progress. "You with your sails, me with my brewing. We maintain standards and techniques that go back centuries." "True," Thomas agreed, savoring the cool ale. "Though we must also innovate. The Navy's experimental sail program has taught me that tradition should be a foundation, not a prison." Their philosophical discussions were interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Blackwood, recently promoted to commander and given his own ship, a new brig called HMS Rapid, designed for speed and maneuverability. He wanted Thomas to create her sails, incorporating all the lessons learned from the experimental program. "She's built for chasing slavers off the African coast," Blackwood explained. "Speed is essential, we need to catch them before they can dispose of their human cargo. Every knot of speed your sails can provide might mean lives saved." The moral dimension of the commission added weight to the work. Thomas had always taken pride in his craft, but knowing that these particular sails would be used in the suppression of slavery gave them special significance. He selected his finest canvas and assigned his most skilled workers to the project. The complexity of managing multiple major commissions tested Thomas's organizational abilities. HMS Ardent needed her new courses, HMS Rapid required a full suit of sails, Admiral Seymour wanted modifications to Seahorse's rigging, and regular merchant commissions couldn't be ignored. The sail loft hummed with activity from dawn to dusk. James proved invaluable during this busy period, effectively managing one entire commission while Thomas focused on the more complex work. Robert, preparing to establish his own workshop in Southampton, spent his final weeks absorbing every possible lesson, understanding that he would soon face similar challenges alone. One evening, as they worked late to complete Arden's main course, Robert asked a question that had clearly been on his mind. "Master Hartwell, do you think our trade will survive? With steam engines and iron ships, will there still be sail makers in 50 years? Thomas paused in his stitching, considering his response. Through the windows, they could see the harbor lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Among the sailing vessels, a steam packet boat chugged past, its funnel belching black smoke. "The world changes, Robert, that's certain. But wind is free and eternal, while coal is expensive and must be carried. I believe sails will adapt rather than disappear. Perhaps they'll work alongside engines, perhaps they'll find new purposes we haven't imagined. But as long as humans venture onto the water, they'll need some way to harness the wind." The completion of both naval commissions coincided with the summer solstice, the longest day allowing them to work until nearly 10 o'clock without artificial light. As the final stitches were placed in HMS Rapid's main royal, Thomas felt the deep satisfaction of work well done. The installation of sails on both vessels became something of a Portsmouth event. HMS Rapid's sleek lines and new sails drew admiring crowds, while Arden's refurbishment reminded observers of her distinguished service record. Thomas stood with his workers, watching as their creations were bent to the yards and unfurled for testing. Commander Blackwood personally thanked each member of Thomas's team, understanding that their combined efforts had created sails that would serve his mission. "When we intercept slavers, when we free those unjustly imprisoned, your work will have made it possible," he told them. Young Timothy seemed to grow inches taller at such words, understanding for the first time the true importance of their craft. It wasn't just about creating functional objects, it was about enabling noble purposes, supporting those who risked their lives for justice. The summer of 1848 passed in a blur of work and achievement. News from the continent remained turbulent, but Britain remained stable, her naval power a reassuring constant in an uncertain world. Ships departed Portsmouth regularly, their holds filled with manufactured goods, their masts carrying sails from Thomas's loft and others like it. One particularly memorable commission came from an unexpected source, a missionary society fitting out a vessel to carry supplies and personnel to the Pacific Islands. The ship, a converted merchant bark renamed Haven, needed sails that could withstand the long Pacific voyages while being manageable by a crew more familiar with Bibles than rigging. Thomas took special care with Haven's sails, making them slightly smaller than standard to ease handling, and adding extra reinforcements to help them survive the inexpert treatment they might receive. He also created detailed diagrams showing proper sail handling procedures, knowing they would be studied by landlubbers trying to master seafaring skills. The missionary leader, a sincere young man named Reverend Davies, spent hours in the sail loft learning about his vessel's canvas. His enthusiasm reminded Thomas of his own apprentices, eager to absorb knowledge that might prove vital later. "We carry more than supplies, Master Hartwell," the Reverend explained. "We carry hope, education, medicine. Your sails will help us reach those who need such things most desperately." As autumn approached, Thomas received news that affected him deeply. His brother William in Devon had suffered a stroke, leaving him partially paralyzed and unable to continue his sail-making work. Thomas immediately arranged to visit, leaving James in charge of the loft. The journey to Devon gave Thomas time to reflect on mortality and legacy. The coaching roads wound through countryside beginning to show autumn colors, past villages and towns that had existed for centuries, through a landscape that seemed eternal yet was constantly changing in subtle ways. He found William in better spirits than expected, though clearly frustrated by his physical limitations. They spent hours talking about their craft, their father's teachings, the changes they had witnessed in their decades of work. William's son had taken over the business, maintaining the family tradition, which provided some comfort. "I sometimes wonder if we chose this life or it chose us," William mused from his chair overlooking Dartmouth Harbor. "Born into it, trained from childhood, never really considering alternatives." "Would you choose differently if you could?" Thomas asked. William was quiet for a moment, watching a fishing boat return with the tide. "No. There's honor in honest craft, in creating something useful with your own hands. We've clothed thousands of vessels, sent millions of square yards of canvas across the oceans. That's a legacy worth having." Thomas returned to Portsmouth with renewed appreciation for his health and ability to continue working. He also brought William's collection of sail patterns, accumulated over decades, including some dating back to their grandfather's time. These templates represented generations of accumulated knowledge, refined techniques passed down and improved by each generation. The patterns found a place of honor in the Portsmouth loft, mounted on the walls where apprentices could study them, understanding that they were part of a tradition stretching back centuries. Timothy was particularly fascinated by the older patterns, seeing how sail design had evolved to meet changing needs. October brought news that HMS Arden had successfully rounded Cape Horn and reached Valparaiso, her new sails performing admirably in the notorious storms of the Drake Passage. Captain Morrison's report, forwarded by the Admiralty, specifically commended the sail's performance in winds that had dismasted another vessel in their convoy. Such vindication was deeply satisfying, but Thomas took more pleasure in knowing that Arden's crew had survived the passage safely. Every sailor aboard owed something to the careful work done in the Portsmouth loft, though few would ever think of the sailmaker who had labored over their canvas. As winter approached, bringing its familiar challenges of cold and early darkness, Thomas began thinking about succession. He was nearing 50, still capable but aware that his strength and eyesight would eventually decline. James had developed into an excellent sailmaker, while Robert had successfully established himself in Southampton. But Timothy showed the greatest promise, combining natural ability with deep curiosity about the craft. Thomas began spending extra time with Timothy, sharing not just techniques but philosophy, the deeper understanding that separated a master craftsman from a mere technician. They would work side by side on complex projects, Thomas explaining his thought process, the reasoning behind each decision. "Sailmaking is like writing," he explained one gray November afternoon as they worked on a particularly challenging spinnaker for a racing yacht. "Anyone can learn the letters and form words, but creating something that truly serves its purpose requires understanding the deeper principles." The Christmas season of 1848 brought unexpected joy when HMS Rapid returned to Portsmouth with news of a successful anti-slavery patrol. Commander Blackwood visited the sail loft with stories of their adventures, of chases through tropical storms, of freed slaves' tears of joy, of the pride in serving such a noble cause. "Your sails never failed us, Master Hartwell," Blackwood reported. "Even when we pushed them beyond reasonable limits, they held. We overtook 3 slavers that might have escaped with inferior canvas." He also brought gifts from the freed slaves, simple items of carved wood and woven grass, made by people who had little but wanted to express gratitude to those who had helped secure their freedom. Thomas displayed these in the sail loft, tangible reminders of their work's human impact. As 1849 began, Thomas noticed changes in the maritime world that suggested his earlier predictions about adaptation were coming true. New hybrid vessels were being designed, using both sail and steam, taking advantage of each method's strengths. These ships would need sails designed to work in conjunction with engines, a new challenge for sailmakers. The Admiralty commissioned Thomas to develop sail plans for these hybrid vessels, recognizing his innovative approach and willingness to challenge traditional thinking. It was complex work, requiring collaboration with engineers and naval architects who sometimes struggled to understand the subtleties of sail dynamics. One particularly heated discussion involved the placement of funnels and their effect on sail efficiency. The engineers wanted the funnel position for optimal engine performance, while Thomas argued this would create turbulence that would significantly reduce sail effectiveness. Eventually, they reached a compromise that satisfied both requirements. Spring brought personal change when James announced his engagement to a sailmaker's daughter from London, planning to establish himself in that great port after marriage. Thomas gave his blessing, knowing that London's massive maritime trade would provide ample opportunity for a skilled craftsman. The wedding, held in Portsmouth's maritime church, brought together sail makers from across southern England. It was a rare gathering of the trade, and Thomas found himself among peers, discussing techniques, sharing innovations, lamenting the challenges of training proper apprentices in an age when young men were increasingly drawn to factories and mills. As Thomas watched James exchange vows, he thought about the continuity of their craft. James would train apprentices who would train others, the knowledge and skills passing down through generations like an inheritance more valuable than gold. Returning to work after the wedding, Thomas found a letter waiting that would provide the capstone to this period of his career. The Royal Navy was commissioning a new ship of the line, HMS Sovereign, and wanted Portsmouth's finest sail maker to create her canvas. It would be the largest commission of Thomas's career, requiring sails of enormous size for a vessel that would serve as a symbol of British naval power. The commission would require expanding his operation, taking on additional workers, perhaps even securing larger workspace. It was a daunting prospect for a man approaching his sixth decade, but also an opportunity to create something truly monumental. As he stood in the sail loft that evening, surrounded by the tools and materials of his trade, the patterns inherited from his brother, the gifts from freed slaves, the letters of commendation from naval officers, Thomas understood that his legacy was already secure. He had maintained and advanced an ancient craft, had trained successors to carry it forward, had contributed to noble causes and practical needs alike. The fog was rolling in from the harbor, softening the edges of the world, muffling the sounds of the city. In the brewery below, William was checking his fermenting beer, maintaining his own traditions. The two crafts continued their parallel existence, each essential in its own way to the maritime life that defined Portsmouth. Thomas lit the oil lamps and returned to his workbench. There were still sails to make, still apprentices to train, still innovations to explore. The weakened legacy of Victorian sailmakers, weakened by time, by technological change, by the passing of old masters, would be strengthened again through dedication, skill, and the patient accumulation of knowledge. As he picked up his needle and resumed work on a merchant vessel's topsail, the rhythm of his stitching joined the eternal rhythms of the port city. The tide's ebb and flow, the creak of rigging, the cry of gulls, the footsteps of sailors heading to sea. These sounds had existed before him and would continue after him, but for now, in this moment, he was part of their great symphony. The sailmaker worked on as darkness deepened outside, his movements sure and steady, each stitch a small act of creation, a contribution to the vast enterprise of maritime trade and naval power that sustained an empire. In the warm circle of lamplight, surrounded by the tools and materials of his ancient craft, Thomas Hartwell continued the work that defined his life and would outlive him in every sail that caught the wind and carried vessels across the world's oceans. The fog grew thicker, wrapping Portsmouth in its soft embrace. Ships at anchor disappeared into the gray, their lights becoming mere suggestions of presence. But in the sail loft above the Old Anchor Brewery, work continued, as it had for generations and would for generations more, the patient craft of creating wings for humanity's oceanic ambitions. As the night deepened and the city settled into sleep, Thomas finally set aside his work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new commissions, new opportunities to perfect his craft. But tonight, he was content, knowing that his life's work had meaning, that every sail he created carried with it something of himself, his skill, his dedication, his contribution to something greater than any individual could achieve alone. The legacy of the Victorian sailmaker was not weakened but transformed, adapted to new realities while maintaining ancient truths. In the quiet of the Portsmouth night, with the fog muffling all sound except the distant tolling of ships' bells marking the watches, that legacy continued, stitch by stitch, sail by sail, voyage by voyage, into an uncertain but hopeful future.